The current atmosphere of polarization, of toxicity, of misinformation, of disinformation, of anger directed at individuals and institutions is not a healthy trend line.
Harassment of MPs has increased dramatically over the past 5 years. The House Sergeant-at-Arms reports an 800% increase of harassment on social media and at in-person events, leaving some MPs to choose not to run for office again. How can we better protect elected officials? How big of an issue is this? Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. Paul Wells is a journalist and author. In fact, he's got a new book out about Justin Trudeau right now. He joins us from Ottawa. Emily Nicolas is a columnist with Le Devoir in Montreal. And Gary Mason, a columnist with the Globe and Mail, and he's in Vancouver. Good to see everyone. I feel like we could talk about this issue all day, every day almost, because it is so brutal, I think, for many public figures, but particularly for parliamentarians, many of whom have all sorts of personal security concerns or personal security protection. But I guess the statistic is pretty shocking. Paul, why don't you start us off? How much do you think this has to do with social media, people being, getting access to parliamentarians online?
It has almost everything to do with that.
Yeah.
20 years ago, if I was careless about boundaries and not very bright and angry at an MP, I was alone, probably in my mother's basement, complaining about this sort of stuff. Social media allows these kinds of people to find one another, to federate, and to egg one another on, with the results that we see. And lately, the leading political social media platform, X, formerly Twitter, is not good for much else besides that. And so you're right. I mean, I've known MPs who have had to hire personal protection because the rules didn't give them access to anything in the course of business. There have been stories about, in Quebec, large numbers of municipal politicians, especially women, deciding not to run again, precisely because of social media. And it's not clear to me what's to be done except to keep saying this is unacceptable. It is never right to threaten anyone, and having the internet between you and them doesn't make it better. It's still odious and unacceptable.
Yeah, and we've even seen it escalate to, I think it was Mélanie Joly had a protest outside of her home in Montreal. I think it was issues related to the Middle East, which is also kind of, frightening, I would imagine. Emily, should MPs then not be on social media? I know, Paul, I'm not outing you, but Paul is not on X. He's not on Twitter. Is that the solution, just to walk away from these places where you are harassed like this?
I really don't think so. I think the problem with social media is broader than this. The problem is that we have, as I guess government, states plural, have lost control of where people interact. And people are now increasingly interacting on platforms that no state is capable of regulating properly. And so we've lost control of our agora, of our fora, essentially, as a society. And so what happens is that you always had, malign narcissists around, but you do now have a culture which rewards them and sees them be able to gain followers because of antisocial behavior. And those people are now hailed as heroes, and that's a culture change that doesn't just exist on social media. This idea that the more of a bully you are, the more cool you are, is something that expands as well in our politics. We've seen the change in question period. We've seen the change of behavior in the House of Commons. And I think we've also seen the change of how people are writing in traditional media as well. The thing that is often unnamed when we talk about harassment of public figures is that, yes, it happens on social media, but even in my own experience, the worst kind of death threats that I've received were happening on social media at the call of people in traditional media, columnists and or MPs, MNAs, who do personal attacks, who have large media followership, and then the trolls get to you because they were whistleblowed by people who have power in traditional in traditional institutions. That's the Donald Trump phenomenon as well. The person was president of the United States. He's been basically targeting harassment on a lot of people, but he's a person that has both followership on social media and on traditional media. And I think we do need to be able to name that. And as people in the House of Commons, people in traditional media need to understand that if there's a culture change that we're embarking on, then we cannot just blame the platforms, and we're also participating in that culture shift.
A lot to break down there, Gary. That was very thoughtful, Emily. I mean, it is kind of a loop, a cycle, right? The social media, all the things that Paul said, and then politicians starting to play to social media and feeding into it. And it seems like, how are we ever going to break that cycle? While it's at the same time sort of scaring off potential political candidates, voices that you would want to see inside the House of Commons.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with my colleagues that, I mean, social media certainly has a lot to do with it, and probably the largest part. But it's also politicians that are stoking a lot of this anger. I mean, from my perch in Vancouver, I pay attention quite a bit to what's going on in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the anger that is stoked in those two provinces towards Ottawa and specific politicians in particular, Mr. Trudeau, the Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault. I mean, if you tell people that these people want to destroy your province, are out to destroy your province, want to eliminate, 50,000 jobs in the oil and gas industry. I mean, if you tell these people enough that continually beat that drum, it's going to have an impact. I mean, it was no surprise that the heart of the Freedom Convoy organization came from the prairies. I mean, there are a lot of angry people there who have been sort of indoctrinated by the leadership in that province, the political leadership in that province, to believe anything liberal in Ottawa is bad and is out to destroy your life. And those words have consequences after a while. And we've seen this play out in Alberta. I mean, one of the worst episodes of harassment that we've witnessed in the last few years happened in the summer of 2022 when Chrystia Freeland was in Grand Prairie and was accosted by a large, physically imposing man who went up to her and told her to basically get the bleep out of Alberta, that she was a traitor to the country. It was a very, very scary situation, I'm sure, for her and her all-female staff. And, nothing happened to the guy. I mean, a year later, he was organizing another convoy to protest pedophilia that was being orchestrated by politicians. So it's not all just social media. I think politicians and politicians outside of Ottawa have to take some responsibility for what's going on.
To be fair, just to give an example on the other side, Michelle Rempel-Garner has written an awful lot about abuse that she has faced online.
Absolutely.
And been very forceful in her words about how to deal with that. So, Paul, how much are politicians responsible for contributing to an atmosphere and an environment where it's sort of normal that they would then be harassed at some point?
I do think that a lot of the discourse in our politics is harsher and less thoughtful than it used to be. The contrast between Joe Clark, even Brian Mulroney as conservative leader versus Pierre Poilievre. But it's important to draw distinctions, and they do. Pierre Poilievre got a lot of coverage for walking past a sticker representing the organization Diagolon. He got less coverage when he called Diagolon a bunch of odious losers and called the RCMP on them for threatening his wife. I believe the Canadian politicians have generally made it clear that violence and threats of violence and harassment are unacceptable. And there is a real difference between Canadian politicians as a class and Donald Trump, whose speeches for years contained extended meditations on the usefulness of large-scale violence. So I do think that most of our politicians could stand to shut down their social media accounts, but I also believe that on the specific question of violence, our politicians have generally been clear.
And just listening to you guys, there's a lot of lessons that apply to adults as well. Thank you for that first conversation. We'll be back to you in the next hour. Appreciate it very much.